People who stuck with their partners during hard times. Where are you now? Story 1. My wife once got mad at me because I stayed up late playing video games. The next morning, she started yelling about how I should have gone to bed with her instead of staring at a screen all night. I was about to argue back when I had this epiphany mid-rant. I just started laughing. She got even angrier and shouted, "What's so funny?" Through my laughter, I said, "You're obsessed with me. You love me so much you're mad I wasn't with you, even when you were unconscious." She turned bright red, completely flustered, and just walked out of the room. That was the day I won an argument by making her blush. Story 2. My husband and I used to have these wild fights, the kind where one of us would storm out, slam the door, and say something dramatic like, "I'm done." One night, after a particularly ridiculous argument about the dishwasher of all things, we both stormed off in opposite directions. Then, from the other room, I hear him yell, "I'm not going anywhere." And I scream back, "Well, neither am I." Without missing a beat, he shouts, "I love you." And I scream, "I love you too." That's when I realized we were too stubborn to break up, so we might as well stay married. Story 3. My wife and I once got into a screaming match about something completely stupid. I can't even remember what it was. At one point, she threw her hands in the air and said, "Why do you have to be so difficult?" I blurted out, "Because I love you and want to have babies with you someday." That completely threw her off. She froze, blinked, and then said, "You're ridiculous." I shrugged and said, "Well, I'm not yelling in front of our imaginary kids, so you better figure out how to tell me what's wrong without shouting." She burst out laughing, and just like that, the fight was over. Story 4. When my wife visited me in the hospital after my motorcycle accident, she was determined to cheer me up. She wheeled me around town in a rickety wheelchair, pointing out random things to make me laugh. At one point, she got so distracted by an ugly building she called architectural garbage that she rolled me straight into a pothole. I went flying forward and she panicked, yelling, "Oh my God, are you okay?" I couldn't stop laughing, even as I tried to climb out of the hole. Now, whenever we pass a pothole, I remind her she's the only person who's tried to kill me with urban infrastructure. Story 5. I stayed late at work one night and came home to find my husband sulking. When I asked him what was wrong, he dramatically pointed to the dinner he'd cooked and said, "I made spaghetti for two, but I ate it alone. Alone." I tried to apologize, but he cut me off, waving his fork in the air. "Do you know what it's like to eat a romantic dinner with no romance?" He kept this act up for an hour, and I couldn't stop laughing. To this day, he still brings up the spaghetti betrayal whenever I'm late for anything. Story 6. I stuck it out for over 15 years with my ex-husband. He had a tough upbringing which turned into an even tougher adulthood. He struggled with untreated mental health issues, spent years in and out of dead-end jobs, and had a habit of drinking away our meager savings when things got hard. I was the one holding down the fort, paying bills, keeping our two kids clothed and fed, and doing everything to make up for his shortcomings. I thought love and loyalty meant staying, even when it hurt. Things finally broke when I found out he hadn't filed our taxes for 3 years and had lied about it the entire time. I was hit with a massive tax bill that nearly destroyed me. After months of fighting and sleepless nights, I packed up my kids and left. A dear friend let us crash with her while I got back on my feet. I worked my way out of the debt, repaired my credit, and eventually fell in love with someone who was a complete surprise, my roommate at the time. 7 years later, we're happily married, raising my kids together, and I finally know what it means to feel safe and supported. Life isn't perfect, but I can't believe I ever settled for less than what I have now. Story 7. I met my wife during a chaotic time in my life. I was working as a referee at a football tournament when she caught my eye. She worked in the match coordinator's tent, and we spent all our free moments talking. A few weeks later, we planned to meet up in my hometown, but on the same day, I crashed my motorcycle at 70 kilometers per h into a truck. I ended up in intensive care, and my mom had to call her to tell her not to come. Despite this, she called me every day just to keep me company, as I lay in the hospital unable to move. Recovery was brutal. I lost my career, my social life, and nearly my sanity. One night, a doctor told me the pain in my leg might become chronic because of an error during surgery. When my wife-to-be called me that same moment, I broke down completely. Her visit months later was a beacon of hope. She cared for me, wheeled me around town, and accidentally pushed me into a pothole while staring at an ugly building. Even after losing the life I knew, I rebuilt it with her by my side. 13 years later, she's asleep upstairs, and I'm sitting here grateful for the beautiful life we've built with our 2 kids. Story 8. When my wife and I got married, we thought we could face anything together. We were young and full of hope, but life didn't take long to throw us into the deep end. It started with her mother's sudden death. That loss broke something inside her. The woman I knew, the one who laughed loudly and filled every room with her energy, disappeared overnight. She turned to alcohol to cope, drinking away her days and nights while I tried to hold our life together. For 3 years, I carried the weight of everything, raising our kids, working extra hours, cleaning up after her, and trying to shield her from her own worst moments. It wasn't just hard, it was soul-crushing. There were nights when I sat in the car, staring at the steering wheel, wondering if I should just leave. But I couldn't. I knew the real her was still in there, buried under the grief and the alcohol. The turning point came when she landed in the hospital after drinking herself unconscious. The doctor told her bluntly that if she didn't stop, she wouldn't make it another year. For the first time, she looked scared. That fear turned into determination, and she agreed to rehab. The road back was slow and painful. She had to rebuild not just her body but her mind, and I had to learn to trust her again. There were relapses, fights, and moments when we both wanted to give up, but somehow we didn't. Now over a year sober, she's become someone even stronger than the woman I married. She's found new ways to cope, new ways to live, and she's taken back her life. I'll never forget those 3 dark years, but they taught me the depth of what love really means. It's not just about the good times. It's about holding on when everything is falling apart. And because we held on, we've come out stronger than ever. Story 9. My wife and I have been through every kind of hell together. She spiraled into alcoholism after her mother died unexpectedly, and for 3 long years I carried everything on my shoulders, paying bills, making meals, and pulling her out of her worst moments. Not a single person could get through to her. I stayed, not because it was easy, but because I believed in the woman she was underneath it all. It wasn't until her rock bottom, waking up in a hospital after nearly dying from alcohol poisoning, that she decided to fight her way back. Watching her piece herself together, one day at a time, was like watching a miracle. She's been sober for over a year now, and she's become the woman I knew she could be. I don't regret those 3 hard years because I see her strength now, and it reminds me why I stayed. She's not just my wife, she's my inspiration. Story 10. I never thought my life would take such a drastic turn after meeting her at a football tournament. I was a referee, and she was coordinating matches in a tent near the field. During breaks, we'd talk about everything, our families, our dreams, and how we somehow ended up at this random tournament. By the time the weekend ended, I was completely smitten. We made plans for her to visit me in my hometown, 600 kilometers away. But fate had other plans. On the day she was supposed to visit, I crashed my motorcycle into the side of a truck. I was going 70 kilometers per h and didn't stand a chance. I woke up in the hospital with broken bones, internal bleeding, and the crushing realization that my life as I knew it was over. My mom had to call her to cancel the visit, but instead of fading out of my life, she stayed in it. She called me every day while I was in intensive care, just to keep me company. Her voice was the one thing that kept me going. Recovery was brutal. I couldn't walk for months, lost my career as a referee, and watched my social circle disappear because it was all tied to the job I could no longer do. One day, a doctor casually mentioned that a surgical error might leave me with chronic pain for the rest of my life. I remember lying there in that hospital bed, paralyzed with fear and despair. That same day she called, and as soon as I heard her voice, I broke down crying. She didn't know what to say, but just hearing her tell me it would be okay made all the difference. Months later, she finally visited. She wheeled me around town, making jokes and trying to distract me from the pain. At one point, she accidentally pushed my wheelchair into a pothole because she was too busy gawking at a hideous building. It was the first time I'd laughed in months. Slowly, we rebuilt a life together. I moved to her hometown, started fresh, and found a new passion. Now, 13 years later, we have 2 beautiful kids, a cozy home, and a bond that feels unbreakable. That accident took away so much, but it also gave me everything, her. Story 11. My husband once tried to fix the washing machine himself instead of calling a repairman. He watched a YouTube tutorial and declared he was now a washing machine whisperer. I told him it was a bad idea, but he insisted. 10 minutes later, water was shooting out of the machine like a geyser, and he was trying to block it with a mop while screaming, "I've made a mistake!" I laughed so hard I couldn't even help him. We ended up calling a professional, and now every time something breaks, I ask him if he plans to whisper it back to life. Story 12. I was married for 17 years to a man I thought I could fix. When we first met, he was charming but broken, struggling with depression, alcoholism, and a general lack of direction. I stood by him through every relapse, every failure to hold a job, and even when he got arrested. But the breaking point came when I discovered he had lied about filing our taxes for 3 years. I found myself drowning in $20,000 of debt. I stuck it out a little longer for the sake of our dogs and home, but eventually, I realized I couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved. With the help of a friend, I moved out and started over. My new roommate turned into the love of my life. We've been happily married for 7 years now, and I finally feel like I can breathe again. My only regret? Not leaving sooner. Story 13. I'll never forget the day my husband looked me in the eye and asked, "Are we fighting to stay together or to pull apart?" It stopped me in my tracks. We were both exhausted, him from battling depression and me from carrying the weight of our family's emotional and financial needs. That conversation was the turning point. We both decided we were all in. Therapy wasn't easy, but we pushed through every session, unearthing years of pain and miscommunication. 3 years later, we're stronger than ever. I don't take our partnership for granted anymore. Every day, I'm reminded that love isn't just a feeling. It's a decision you make, over and over again, even when it's hard. Story 14. My wife has a habit of talking in her sleep. One night she sat straight up, pointed at me, and shouted, "The penguins are coming!" I just stared at her, half asleep, and said, "What penguins?" She laid back down, completely serious, and mumbled, "Don't say I didn't warn you." The next morning she didn't remember a thing, but I couldn't stop calling her my penguin prophet for weeks. Story 15. I stuck with my ex-wife through everything. When her father passed away, she spiraled into grief and pushed everyone away, including me. I thought sticking by her would show her how much I cared. What I didn't know was that she had been cheating on me for years. I found out while she was in the middle of her cancer treatments, but I didn't leave because of our kids. When she passed, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. After everything, I finally had the space to rebuild my life. Years later, I met someone incredible who showed me what real partnership looks like. It's bittersweet to look back, but I'm proud of the man I am now. Stronger, wiser, and more grateful than ever for this second chance. Story 16. I was married for 17 years to someone who, frankly, made every day harder than it needed to be. He struggled with alcoholism, untreated depression, and an endless stream of get-rich-quick schemes that always left us worse off. Still, I stayed, because that's what I thought love was, sticking it out, no matter what. But the breaking point came when I discovered he hadn't filed our taxes for 3 years, and the IRS came after us for over $20,000. It felt like betrayal on top of betrayal. I left, taking my kids and what little dignity I had left. A friend took us in while I got back on my feet, and that was the beginning of my new life. My roommate at the time ended up being my biggest support, and before I knew it, we fell in love. We've been happily married for 7 years now, and every day I'm reminded of what a healthy, supportive relationship looks like. Leaving was the hardest decision I've ever made, but it's also the best one. Looking back, I wish I'd left sooner, but I'm grateful I finally chose myself and my kids over a relationship that was sinking us all. Story 17. My wife and I have been through more storms than most people face in a lifetime. We met young, grew up together, and weathered every challenge that came our way. But the hardest came when her mom died suddenly. It broke something in her. She spiraled into alcoholism, drinking every day to numb the pain. For 3 years I carried us both, keeping the bills paid, making sure our kids were okay, and pulling her out of some dark moments. There were nights I didn't think she'd survive, and plenty of times I wondered if I should leave. But I couldn't give up on her, not when I knew who she was underneath the grief. Finally, one night after a hospital visit that nearly took her life, she decided to get help. It was a slow climb back, one day at a time, but she made it. She's been sober for over a year now, and the woman I see today is stronger and more incredible than ever. I'm proud of her, but I'm also proud of us. Those years were hell, but they proved that love isn't just about the good times. It's about standing in the fire and coming out together. Story 18. I'll never forget the moment my ex-husband told me he didn't love me anymore. We had been together for over a decade, and I had stuck by him through every imaginable hardship. He struggled with depression, couldn't hold down a job, and spent years working through legal and financial messes that I always had to clean up. I thought we were a team, but apparently I was just his safety net. He admitted he wanted to get back with his ex, and that's when I realized I had been holding on to an illusion. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal. It was realizing how much of myself I had lost in the process. I left with nothing but my kids and the determination to rebuild. It wasn't easy, but I found a new job, repaired my credit, and started living for myself again. Now, years later, I'm in a much better place emotionally and financially. I've even found someone new who treats me the way I always deserved to be treated. I look back at that version of me and feel sorry for her, but also proud. She had no idea how strong she was. Story 19. I once surprised my wife with breakfast in bed. I thought it was romantic. Pancakes, coffee, the works. But instead of being touched, she gasped, "Why is the smoke alarm going off?" Turns out I'd set the oven mitt on fire while I was flipping pancakes and didn't even notice. She spent the next hour eating while laughing so hard she cried. To this day, she tells people, his heart was in the right place, but his kitchen skills were in a whole different time zone. Story 20. My husband and I had one of those make-or-break moments in our marriage that changed everything. He was in a dark place, battling depression and anger issues that made life unbearable at times. I was doing everything to hold our family together, but I was running on empty. One night, after a particularly bad fight, I told him I couldn't do it anymore. That's when he asked, "Are we going to fight for this, or are we done?" That question hit me hard. It wasn't just up to him. It was up to both of us. We decided to fight. Therapy was brutal. We had to face things neither of us wanted to admit about ourselves or our relationship. But slowly, we started to rebuild. 3 years later, we're closer than ever. He's in a much healthier place, and I've learned to set boundaries and ask for what I need. Our marriage isn't perfect, but it's real, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. That night could have ended us, but instead, it became the foundation for everything we've built since. Story 21. When I met my wife, I didn't know what resilience looked like, but I've learned from her every day since. We met young, fell in love fast, and thought we had the world figured out. Then life hit us hard. I had a serious motorcycle accident a few months into dating, which left me unable to walk for months and permanently derailed my career. She could have walked away, most people would have, but she didn't. Instead, she called me every day while I was in the hospital, came to visit as soon as I was able, and pushed me around in a wheelchair through my hometown. Even when everything felt like it was falling apart, she made me feel like I wasn't alone. We've been married for 13 years now, with 2 amazing kids and a life I never could have imagined. That accident took away the future I thought I wanted, but it gave me something far better. A partner who never lets me face anything alone. Story 22. I didn't think it was possible to survive the kind of betrayal my ex-husband put me through. We had been together for over a decade, and I had stuck by him through things most people would have run from. His alcoholism, his depression, his inability to hold a steady job. I thought I was being a good wife by staying, by believing that if I just loved him enough, he would change. I worked 2 jobs to support us, managed our household, and even cleaned up his messes when he got into legal trouble. But the real gut punch came when I found out he hadn't been filing our taxes for 3 years. The IRS came knocking, and suddenly I was staring down $20,000 in debt I didn't even know we had. I tried to stick it out for a little while longer, but eventually I realized I couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved. I packed up my kids and left, with nothing but the clothes on our backs in the hope that life could be better without him. A friend let us crash at her place while I got back on my feet, and little by little, I rebuilt my life. The turning point came when my new roommate, a kind, steady man who had been nothing but supportive, became more than just a friend. We fell in love in the quiet, unexpected way that real love often does. 7 years later, we're happily married, raising my kids together, and living a life I never thought was possible. Looking back, I sometimes wonder how I stayed in that marriage for so long, but I also know that every struggle, every sleepless night led me to the life I have now. And for that I'm grateful. I lost so much during those years, but I gained something far more valuable: the courage to choose myself and the chance to build something real.